right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another live discussion with Dr. Sue Dyson and the Train with Trust Project. I am Megan Phillips of the Train with Trust Project, here with Jody Ambrose, also of the Train with Trust Project. We are a nonprofit dedicated to making animal behavior education accessible for everyone and promoting the use of evidence-based animal care and training practices. And Dr. Sue Dyson is kind enough once again to join us to help share information with everyone. Today, we are going to be talking about muscle development and its relationship with soundness, which has been a topic that's been getting a lot of interest since we shared about it. So we hope you're all going to enjoy that today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Jody to host this conversation. And I will be running the PowerPoint in the background, and I'll also be keeping an eye on the social media. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and post those in the comments, and we'll try to address those during the live, or we'll do that in the follow-up afterwards. And with that, I will turn it over to Jody.
Okay, so I think this topic affects everyone that is involved with horses. I think from everything from evaluating a picture of a sale horse to assessing how your training process is going. There's a lot of really valuable information that comes from being able to look at a horse's muscles and know what they can tell us about how that horse is performing. I think that's a super valuable skill that a lot of people are not taught. I don't think every person coming up has that conversation with their trainer about what it is that the trainer or the vet is looking at with their muscle development when they're using that as a cue to either make a decision about buying a certain horse or changing a certain training process, or in particular assessing a soundness issue. So I thought it would be nice if we could sort of take it back to the beginning and really look at, what is possible to tell from a horse's muscles, and what are the factors, what are the indicators that we can see that will tell us something, and what things might be misinterpreted as well. So can we start with just a discussion of how the horse's muscles relate to their soundness, and how important you as an orthopedic vet feel that initial visual impact of a horse's build. How much does that weigh on your evaluation when you're going into looking at a horse's soundness?
Oh, I personally think it's hugely important, and I don't think that enough attention has been paid to this globally through any part of the equestrian industry, nor within the veterinary profession.
Mm-hmm.
But the horse's muscle development reflects how it has been working. So it's going to reflect the quality of the horse's work, the correctness of the horse's work, and whether or not the horse has been moving its body symmetrically. Because muscles develop, just as in people, according to the work that they're doing. So if they're working properly, over time, they will develop greater muscle mass, and they will develop greater tone. And assuming that the horse is moving symmetrically, the muscles on the left and the right side will develop symmetrically. If the horse is working in an abnormal posture, we're going to see the overdevelopment of some muscle groups and the underdevelopment of other muscle groups. And then you have to ask the question, has the horse not been working in the correct frame because it's uncomfortable and it's adapting its own posture to accommodate its discomfort? Or does it relate to the way in which it's being trained? Or is it a combination of both?
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, I think it's absolutely fundamental that we look at the entire horse and kind of go through a checklist. So if we can go to the first slide, please, Jodie. Megan. Because here we're going to look at
One
a
moment,
horse
I'm going to get this pulled up. Sorry about that.
standing from behind. And I think that the posture of the horse when we're assessing muscles is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So if, for example, I want to assess the symmetry of the muscles of the hindquarters and hind limbs, then it's really important that the horse is standing exactly squarely behind, loading symmetrically, with his head and neck pointing forward, so I can genuinely look and ask, does the right and the left side look symmetrical? And in this horse, if you just press advanced, Jodie, we should see some arrows. We can see that multiple muscle groups are smaller on the right side than the left. So the gluteal muscles at the top, the semimembranosus and semitendinosus muscles, the quadriceps muscles, the muscles on the outside of the gaskin, all of them are smaller on the right side than the left, which tells me that this horse cannot have been moving symmetrically. It must have at least a right hind limb lameness, because otherwise we wouldn't see this diffuse pattern of asymmetry. So it's a really good indicator. The first thing I would do if I was going to look at a horse to buy is to stand it squarely and assess the symmetry of the muscles.
Mm-hmm.
But I would always start at the front and look at the horse from the side first and look and say, how are its neck muscles developed? And then how are its back muscles developed? What about the muscles of the thoracic girdle? And we're going to talk about those a little bit later. What about the abdominal muscles? Are they in tone or are they slack? So does it look as though the horse has got a dropped abdomen? And we're going to see an example of that later too. And then we're going to say, are the pelvic muscles, the muscles of the hindquarters, developed as we would expect relative to the muscles of the back and the neck? Because if things are not in proportion, that also tells us that that horse has not been working in a correct way. And then we're going to look at the quadriceps muscles and the hamstring muscles. And
so when you referred to the muscle groups, this would be a list of the muscle groups that you go through on a checklist. Is that right?
that's how I try to think about it. So then I don't leave anything out. So I'm doing it in a systematic way, and going from the front to the back.
Okay.
Now, we know a little bit from science about back muscle development. So we did quite a large study when we looked at a group of horses working under saddle, and independently they were graded for their work quality on a scale of 0 or 1 to 10, like for dressage marking. And we also looked at saddle fit, and we also looked at whether or not the horse had had any history of time off. And then we measured the dimensions of the back at several predetermined anatomical sites. And we were able to show that those horses with superior work quality had bigger muscle mass, whereas those horses which had an ill-fitting saddle and therefore compromised their back movement had less muscle mass. So their dimensions over the top of their back were smaller. So this illustrates to us how important looking at muscle mass is, and the relative proportions of the muscle mass from front to back. Let's go to the next slide, because this is going to show how we cannot assess muscle mass properly if the horse is not standing appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these horses are standing completely non-squarely. The photographs are poor, they're oblique photographs. And we can make some guesses about their muscle development. We can see particularly the horse on the right has got a very sloping appearance with its hindquarters. And so probably its hindquarters are very poorly muscled. But I really cannot make a judgment which is going to be accurate based on horses standing like this. So they need to be standing reasonably squarely, not necessarily perfectly squarely. And we've also got to look at them directly from the side and from the front and from the back, not obliquely
Yeah,
like this.
that's something that I see a lot in sale pictures. I always say I can't evaluate a horse from a still picture for sales because they're so rarely of value. But also, I've seen, particularly in the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of people doing before and after shots of their horses for to demonstrate, that they've been developing a top line. And often the two pictures have completely different posture, and neither of them are particularly useful. And the lighting and the hair coat and all sorts of other things seem to be different between the two.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go to the next slide because we need to consider the body condition score of the horse and ask, look at this shape, and how much of this shape is related to muscle mass versus obesity. So this was a dressage horse working at Prix Saint-Georges level, and we can see it's got a huge crest. But horses, and this is a gelding, and it was gelded at 2 years of age, not a stallion. And when you see that huge crest, you immediately think this is probably an obese horse. And then if you look at the area behind the shoulder blades, there's a lighter patch of hair, and that actually is a big fat pad there. So if you were to palpate that, that would have a convex contour. And then if you look above the tail, it looks as though there's a lump above the tail. And that lump above the tail is fat. That's right, shown by the arrow. That's fat. So this horse is obese. It's got a body condition score, I would say, of 8 out of 9. You're going to have to use both visual impression and palpation, feeling the muscles in order to make that judgment. But this horse is obese, and this horse is going to be difficult, more challenging to say, are its muscles well developed? I would still say that if we look at the loin area, the area behind where the saddle would sit, for Prix Saint-Georges dressage horse, these muscles are not very well developed. And I always feel the muscles as well. So a muscle that is being well used in a horse that is in regular work will have a certain firmness when you press on it. It will have muscle tone. Whereas if horses have got muscles that are not being used properly, they tend to be much softer to the touch and almost flabby. So we can make a judgment about how a horse is using muscles, not just looking at the muscle development, but also feeling the muscles. So the muscles that are being used properly will have tone. And so when you press on them, you can't easily depress them. And you've got to differentiate between that muscle tone and the muscles being overly tense. So this horse has not as well developed muscles in the lumbar area, so the area behind the saddle, as I would like to see for a horse working at Prix Saint-Georges level. The muscles, though, were abnormally tense, and they were abnormally tense because the horse has been adapting its way of movement, and therefore there's too much tone in the muscles. So let's go to the next picture or the next slide. Oops. So the way in which the muscles develop are going to reflect the way in which the horse has been worked. And this is a German auction picture. And this is a 3-year-old warm blood being sold as a potential dressage horse. And for me, there are a number of features to note. This horse is not obese, but it has an overdeveloped topline musculature of the neck. For a 3-year-old, for me, this horse is going in a very short neck frame. And when we look at the neck musculature, which looks huge, and we look at the lumbar area and the pelvic region of the hindquarters, the muscles are far less well developed. And that reflects the fact that this horse, to me, for a 3-year-old, is working in an incorrect frame. It's being constrained in front and therefore and kept with a very short neck. So the top line muscles of the neck are overdeveloped. And yet, although it looks as though it's got an extravagant hind limb action, in fact, it's not using its hind limbs properly. And when we look at the whole front end and we look at the shoulder musculature as well, the shoulder musculature is overdeveloped relative to the lumbar musculature and the musculature of the pelvic region and hind limbs. So this is a horse which is a potential disaster because of the frame in which it's being worked and because it's not developing the muscles in the correct way. And if we add to that, which is also an important factor to consider, we see we've got quite a large rider sitting right on the back of the saddle. And that posture in the saddle is overloading the back of the saddle and is going to impair back movement, so impair overall back muscle development. And I think so you need to look at the horse as a whole. And I would say this horse looks completely unbalanced, huge development of the muscles of the neck and the shoulder region, and poor development of the muscles of the lumbar region and the pelvic region and hind limbs. So this is all wrong.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about how horses being behind the vertical is an issue that is fairly easy for the layperson to be able to identify because it's a simple criteria. I feel like this sort of in a related way, people have an easier time seeing neck muscles than they do seeing there. You know, it's less complex to identify a big neck muscle than it is to identify all of the different muscles in the hindquarters. And so I think a lot of time, I think this is the trend that I see in, photos that are chosen to either advertise or chosen in the media is horses that look like this, where they're really big and impressive in the neck and shoulder, because it's easy for people to see the development, whereas they miss the lack of development in the hindquarters or don't know what they're looking at, which is what we're trying to address here is, to identify how to see the imbalance and how to focus in on the things that maybe won't be so obvious.
Yes, because I think people get grabbed by this and say, oh, what an impressive horse, what a fabulous movement. But in fact, it's not. And if we look at the degree of flexion of the hind limb versus the degree of raising of the forelimb, they just don't match.
Yeah.
But that's unfortunately what is being rewarded by judges, and how the majority of these young horses are being produced for sale.
Yep.
Which to me is completely wrong for promoting longevity of the horses.
Yep.
Because unless the horse has developed a balanced musculature, it's not going to have sufficient strength and coordination to perform the movements that it's going to be asked to do. And it's really important that we develop the appropriate musculature in the right pattern.
I have a question about, and maybe you're going to get to this with the role of nutrition, but you mentioned indicators of obesity. Do you need to be just as concerned about a horse being underweight and how that might be affecting the appearance of their muscles?
Yes, and I didn't include a slide of this because the underweight horse will have lack of muscle because it's not getting adequate nutrition to sustain the muscle mass.
Right.
And then you have to differentiate between the lean fit horse, so the lean fit 3-day event horse or race horse, which is not carrying excessive fat but has well-developed muscles versus the horse that is not receiving adequate nutrition and therefore cannot sustain muscle mass. And then it comes down to assessing muscle tone as well, and also seeing the pattern of the muscle loss, which are important differentiating factors.
Mm-hmm.
A horse can only develop the appropriate muscles and muscle strength if it has the appropriate nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this kind of misconception that we need high levels of protein, and most horses do not need particularly high levels of protein to develop adequate muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
So most compounded feeds have sufficient proteins to support adequate muscle development.
Mm-hmm.
And people tend to almost over supplement with protein,
Mm-hmm.
which is not necessary because it's just a waste of money.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move to the next horse, which is a horse, again, a relatively high level dressage horse competing at Prix Saint-Georges. And this has got an overall better muscle development. So the front end, the middle, and the back end are much more in proportion compared with the previous horse, or the previous horses. And this is the sort of balance that we want to see. I guess if I was to criticize this horse, I would like to see it a bit more rounded in its hindquarter muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
But this is perfectly acceptable. If I saw this at a pre-purchase examination, I wouldn't be ringing any alarm bells.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a nice curvature to the top line of the neck. So it's convex, almost down to the withers. The muscles on the underside of the neck are not overdeveloped. And we've got nice muscle development along the entire back. And as I said, I think I would like to see the pelvic muscle mass a little bit more developed. This was a horse ridden by an amateur rider. She wasn't the greatest of riders, and I suspect that if this horse was trained a little better, we would see better muscle mass of the hindquarters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's go on now to talk about something which is a little bit topical, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something that I'm going to talk about, we can't assess the actual muscle development of the muscles of the thoracic sling, but we can look at a horse's shape. And what's important to recognize that for the horse, each forelimb is attached to the rest of the body by muscles. It's not attached by a collarbone. The horse doesn't have a collarbone. So the shoulder blades or the scapulae are attached to the ribs and the sternum by muscles. And we've indicated those muscles by the red. So starting from the top, we've got the thoracic serratus muscle, and then the subclavian muscles, and then the pectoral muscles. And then if we look at the picture on the left, we can see that the top of the spinous process of the third thoracic vertebrae is way above the black horizontal line. And when we look at the lower horizontal line, we can see that there's a relatively short distance between that line and the lower end of the sternum. And this is an example of correctly developed and used muscles such that these thoracic sling muscles are supporting everything. Whereas in the picture on the right, those muscles look longer and they are at a larger angle relative to the ribs and the sternum because they're not being used properly. And it's really important, if the horse is going to work correctly, that it develops the ability to contract these muscles that support the rib cage and support the scapulae, so that the horse can elevate its front end. Because we all know that the horse has to push from behind, but pushing from behind is only going to be optimally effective if the horse can raise its forehand and it can raise its withers by contracting those muscles, as we see in the image on the left. So in the image on the left, the top of the spinous process of the third thoracic vertebra is considerably higher than the tops of the scapulae, and the tops of the scapulae are indicated by that horizontal line. And this is an important concept to appreciate, but obviously these muscles are on the inside of the scapula, and we can't evaluate their muscle development.
Right.
All we can say is how we can make a comment about the overall shape of the horse and the position of the scapulae versus the tops of the spinous processes.
Well, and wouldn't the muscles that we can see relate to the change in relation to these as well?
We can see the muscles on the outside of the scapulae, but they actually have less a role in terms of being able to lift the forehand than these muscles on the inside. So just looking at the external muscles of the shoulder doesn't necessarily tell us what we need to know.
I was thinking more of the top line, like the thoracic and lumbar muscles, those change in relation to
we will see some pictures of the neck, which I think will illustrate a little bit about what's happening when the neck is not being used appropriately. And the neck has to be used appropriately in order to allow the muscles of the thoracic sling to be properly engaged.
Right.
So we'll come to that.
Okay.
So let's go to the next pictures. And here we have two horses being warmed up for a dressage competition. They were competing at elementary level. I'm not sure what that is in US terms. They have to do shoulder in, leg yield.
Like first and second level.
Yeah. So both of these horses, to me, are being worked inappropriately. Their heads are behind the vertical position. They cannot properly in this situation, engage properly the muscles of the thoracic sling, and they cannot properly engage also the muscles of the back.
Right.
So if we look at the chestnut horse on the left, we can see that the muscles behind the saddle are not well developed. Just that area there and in front as we go towards the back of the saddle pad. And this horse is also not being helped because, again, the rider is sitting on the back of the saddle, and his upper body is a little bit behind the vertical position as well, which is exactly the posture that the rider on the right has adopted. And both of them have backward moving hands, those are the hands that are restraining the horse's ability to lengthen its neck frame and therefore to engage the muscles of the thoracic girdle. So let's go to the next picture when we see a much nicer way of moving in horses working at different levels. So in the top left, we have a horse that was working at novice level. The pony doing the trot pole exercise was working at elementary level. And then we have on the right, Dr. Rainer Klimke with Alaric, who was a lovely Grand Prix horse. And if you look at the way, this is how I think dressage horses should look, and it's how they used to look in terms of the posture of the head and neck, the limb flight, and the appropriate development of the muscles. And all of these horses, in slightly different ways, because they're at different levels of development, have got much better developed muscles than the horses that we saw in the previous photographs. Much, much better. So let's go to the next slide, which is another dressage horse. Now this is was a stallion. It's no longer a stallion. And again, I think I've selected this just to say, look at the horse as a whole and ask yourself, does this horse look in proportion? And again, it's a horse which has got overdevelopment of the top line muscles of the neck because it's been worked in a hyperflexed way, and the muscles of the hindquarters are not as well developed as they should be. The horse is not standing ideally, I will admit that. Let's go to the next slide and just look at how a change in posture can influence the appearance of the neck muscles. So that we haven't asked the horse to change its position. This is what it did voluntarily over a period of several minutes. And you just see the different shapes of the neck. But the one thing I want you to be very aware of is if you come forward from the withers, you've got more or less continual convexity or straightness of the top line. You haven't got any concavity. Whereas if we compare that with the next picture, on the next slide, we will see something which is very different. So in both of these horses, we have got a concavity just in front of the withers. And that is either because their horses failed to develop two important muscle groups, the rhomboideus cervicis and the trapezius cervicis, or it's lost those muscles because it's being worked incorrectly. Now we can see in the picture of the horse on the left, it's got a rather giraffe-like neck, and this was rather how it tended to work. Whereas on the horse pictured on the right, we can see that there is overdevelopment of the muscles on the lower aspect of the neck, which is indicated by the smaller orange arrow. And this tells me that neither of these horses has been working correctly because they have this concavity in front of the withers. And this is going to reflect the position of their head and neck during work. And in the picture on the right, it will have been too high. We can see because of the overdevelopment of the muscles on the lower aspect of the neck. And as a result of that, they cannot properly engage the muscles of the thoracic sling. And if you just press advance, we'll get another arrow on the horse on the left. There's also overdevelopment of the pectoral muscles because the pectoral muscles are being used excessively. So the pectoral muscles are bigger than they should be. So when we're looking at muscle development, I'm always asking, are the muscles proportionate throughout the body of the horse? Are they underdeveloped in some area, or are they overdeveloped in another area, or do we see a combination? And in these two horses, we see a combination of both underdevelopment and overdevelopment, reflecting the way these horses have been moving, which in both of these horses, I think, reflected the fact that they did have some underlying discomfort, but it also reflected the way in which the riders were attempting to produce these horses. So we have various influences that come into play here. So let's go to the next horse. And this is a horse, again, a dressage horse, which had been working at Prix Saint-Georges level. And it's got that concavity just in front of the withers. It's got overdevelopment of the lower muscles underneath the neck. It's got overdevelopment of the pectoral muscles. And when we look at the abdomen, we can see that we've kind of got a dropped abdomen because the horse has not been engaging properly the abdominal muscles because of the way in which it's being worked. Mm-hmm. And the abdominal muscles help to lift the entire trunk of the horse. But the horse has to be working correctly in order to allow those muscles to develop appropriately. And as we're going to see a little bit later, this work doesn't always have to be done riding the horse. It can be done from the ground as well. So let's just look at the next slide is going to show this horse being worked by its normal rider in the way in which her trainer was telling her that the horse should be worked. So the horse has got a much too short neck frame. It's not being allowed to engage the muscles of the thoracic sling. So it's too much down in front. It's not using its back appropriately. It's not properly engaging the abdominal muscles. And because it also had some hind limb discomfort, its pelvic muscles were not developing appropriately either. So this is the whole way in which this horse is being worked is going to result in the muscle patterns of development that we saw in the previous photograph. And this is why I think everybody needs to pay attention to how horses are being trained, because only if horses are trained optimally will they be able to develop the most appropriate muscles. And that's important because the right muscles are going to support the body, and the muscles need to support the body so that the horse doesn't take incorrect steps, which are going to predispose to the development of lameness through injury. Mm-hmm. So it's a circular argument in terms of why it's so important.
Yeah, I was just that I hear a lot of people say, well, it's just conformational. Their muscles don't look proportional because of their conformation. But like you said, that seems like a circular argument, because if their conformation is causing uneven muscle development, that's going to cause even more asymmetry, and you're going to end up with soundness issues.
Yeah, I think that there is a misconception sometimes of what conformation is versus muscle development. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can have a not perfectly conformed horse that is worked correctly to the best of that horse's ability, given any conformational constraints. It can still develop the right muscles, the correct muscles, in the right way, and look as though it's in balance, more or less.
Yeah.
And that is a crucial thing to understand. And if the horse is worked incorrectly, as we see here, and we've seen in some of the previous photographs, the horse is never going to develop the right muscles. So it's never going to be able to support itself as well as it should be able to, which will predispose it to injury.
Yeah, one big indicator I see is when a horse stops working and their muscle development gets better. I see that quite often.
Yes, that's not a good thing to be able to do. So let's move on to the next slide, which addresses the question as to why do muscles become wasted or they atrophy. And in this horse, we can see it standing beautifully squarely behind on a firm level surface. And we can see that the muscle mass of the left hind quarter is less well developed than that of the right. And this is a warning sign to me that this horse has not been moving symmetrically, and that's probably because it's lame behind. And so to me, if I was to see that at a pre-purchase examination, the alarm bells would be ringing already. So muscles waste away if they're not used. So as you've already said, they may reduce in size because the horse is rested, or they may waste in part because the horse is not moving correctly, either because of the way it's been trained or because of pain. Much, much more rarely, we can have nerve damage. And if we have nerve damage to muscle, the muscle mass will just shrink because muscles must have the right nerve supply in order to develop appropriately. But that's not a common scenario. We will sometimes see muscle wastage due to nerve injury over the shoulder blade on one side, because of nerve damage to the muscles on the outside of the scapula. And if you have equine protozoal myelitis, EPM, then you can have what we call this neurogenic muscle atrophy. And you will get odd patterns of muscle wastage. And that's one of the differentiating factors between horses which are develop in coordination through EPM versus those horses which develop in coordination because of compression of the spinal cord, normally in the neck region. Because those horses may lose muscle mass overall because they're not using their bodies normally, but they don't get unusual asymmetric patterns of muscle atrophy, which we can see with EPM.
Yeah, I was surprised by how dramatic that can be with EPM.
Yes, I mean, you also have to think about how quickly muscles waste. With nerve damage to muscle, the muscles can waste within 7 to 10 days, so remarkably quickly.
Wow.
In some horses which have got lumbosacroiliac joint region pain, the topline muscles will visibly decrease in muscle mass within 4 to 6 weeks of onset of clinical signs. But generally speaking, muscle wastage through disuse, because the horse has not been using the limbs symmetrically, tends to be much slower and more insidious in onset. So let's go to the next horse. And we talked about how much body condition a horse has. And this was an advanced level 3-day event horse. And we can clearly see that this horse was in full work at this time, but it wasn't performing normally. So we can see it's lean, we can see the outline of its ribs, we can see that it's got fairly toned abdominal muscles. So if we look at the lower aspect of the trunk, the thoracic region is lower than the abdominal region. That's a beautiful indicator with the arrow, because those muscles of the abdomen are nicely toned. If we go up to the clip patch on the horse's back, and we've got the saddle area which is not clipped, and we go just behind there, we can see a depression. And this depression is the lack of muscles which have wasted away. This was a horse which had a component of lumbosacroiliac joint region pain, and as a consequence, it develops that concavity between the jumper's bump and the back of the saddle. So that area, that concavity there, is a giveaway that, yes, this horse is a lean horse because it's a fit, lean event horse, but we've got actual wastage of muscles there because the horse has not been using its back properly, because it's protecting the lumbosacral area and therefore not moving properly through its back.
Is that ever caused just by incorrect work, or is that always an indication of pain?
It is, that particular pattern is normally a reflection of discomfort. But what we need to look at, and what I need to both feel and assess, is the entire development of the muscles along the top line. So this horse, in the region underneath the saddle, the muscles had normal tone and they were reasonably well developed. And if it was the result of the way in which the horse was being trained, I would expect all the top line musculature to be less well developed. So let's just look at the next slide. Go on one from here to the grey horse. So this horse has a similar concavity. It's less well defined than the previous horse. And this horse also had a component of lumbosacroiliac joint region pain. And the reason I'm showing this horse is because I'm going to show you in the next slide, please, how we can change that muscle mass by just working the horse from the ground. So this horse had two injuries. It had behind limb a relatively low grade hind limb suspensory ligament injury in the left hind limb, but it also had this component of lumbosacroiliac joint region pain. And this is the horse in March, May, the middle of May and towards the end of May. And all this horse has had was walking exercise, being walked in a chambon daily, doing carrot stretch exercises daily, and doing tail pull exercises to the left and the right daily, and being pushed backwards during its walking exercise several times during a walking exercise program. And I just wanted you to be able to appreciate the change in the muscle mass of the top line and in the tone of the abdominal muscles if we compare the horse sequentially from left to right. And that's just been achieved by exercises from the ground. And I think it's very important to realize how much improvement you can get from exercises on the ground. And for some riders who are, when a horse is recovering from injury, and they are not particularly good riders to be able to ride the horse in the most appropriate way, exercises from the ground can be hugely useful. And if we go to the next slide, I'm going to do a promotional advertisement for a new edition of a book called Pilates and Stretching Exercises for Horses, which is done by Gillian Higgins, which gives a whole host of different exercises specifically designed to develop different muscle groups. So she describes very nicely each type of exercise and how to do it and how many times to do it and how long to sustain a specific posture for, but also relates it to the problems which the horse may have had before. And it comes with a video demonstration as well. And I think it's of its type, it's a really, really good way of learning about what we can achieve from exercises on the ground. And I have worked with a number of people who are good riders and trainers, but also have trained their staff how to use exercises from the ground, and the improvement that they have managed to achieve through that is just phenomenal. So I think to think about working horses in the correct frame when under saddle and combining that with exercises from the ground is potentially very valuable.
Absolutely.
So let's go to the next picture. And this is just really another example of a horse which doesn't have the nicest conformation, and it's got a fairly long back conformation. But in contrast to the previous fit, lean event horse, we can see that its entire top line musculature is not as well developed as it should be. It's got overdevelopment of the muscles on the lower aspect of the neck. It's got overdevelopment of the pectoral muscles, and the muscles of the entire back region and the hindquarters are poorly developed. And this was a horse which had chronic pain-related problems. It had suspensory branch injuries in both hind limbs and a component of sacroiliac region pain. And this pattern of failure to develop the muscles of the back and hindquarters was a reflection of how it had adapted its movement patterns to its underlying pain. And if we go to the next picture, and these are just I'm using them as examples. If you see horses like this, ask why. This horse has got a big neck, it's adequately muscled over its back, but it's got really, really poor muscles of its hindquarters. It's only 2 years of age, and they've tried to break this, and they've tried to reintroduce it to riding. I don't like the term break. They've tried to introduce it to riding on 2 separate occasions, and the horse has been extraordinarily difficult. And I think it's because it had underlying pain, and that's why the hindquarters are so much disproportionately developed relative to the rest of the horse. So we're always looking at the horse as a whole and saying, is the muscle development matching in terms of the front end, the middle, and the back end? And in this horse, the back end is terrible.
Yeah, it's a fantastic example of what we were talking about earlier about it's easier for people to see the front end and miss the back end, because I feel like I see this kind of conformation all the time in young horses, and people don't have a problem with it because it's always young, but it's the overdevelopment of the front end that is really telling in this picture.
Yeah. Let's go to the next picture, and I wanted to introduce the concept of how important a well-fitting saddle is for correct development of the muscles of the back. And this was a study in which we looked at horses that worked for a period of time during a set pattern of work, and their score for trot was given between 1 and 10, and they were also given a score for the quality of their canter between 1 and 10. So they had a possible total of 20, but we can see that the total scores ranged between less than 8 to the top scores of 14. And we measured the back dimensions before and after exercise. And these histograms show, particularly on the left side of the graph, the increase in the back dimensions at specific anatomical locations immediately after exercise. So with the fitting saddles, whatever the quality of the work, be it less than 8 or 14, almost all of the back dimensions increased over during exercise, and they increased the most for the horses that were the highest scoring horses. So if we look at the left hand side of the graph, the horses that scored a combined score of 14 out of 20 had by far the biggest increases. And then if we look at the right hand side of the graph, these were all horses that had ill-fitting saddles. And we can see that the increases in back dimensions are far, far less. And in some instances, the back dimensions actually reduced. They were below 0 during the work period. And this was a 30-minute work period. And so therefore, these horses with incorrectly fitting saddles were not using their back muscles. So the back muscles were not expanding with exercise. And because they're not expanding, they're not going to develop. And this is absolutely crucial, particularly in young horses. If they're going to develop their back muscles properly, they have to have a correctly fitting saddle. Otherwise, the muscles cannot function properly, and those muscles do not develop. And that's incredibly important. Let's go to the next picture. And this applies to any horse. This is a very ordinary cob. This was Joe. And Joe was much loved by his owner, but Joe was not moving well. And if we look at Joe and we look at the saddle area, it looks as though there are concavities in the saddle area. And if you press advance, I think we'll see those back muscles a little bit better. So we've actually got concavity in the back underneath the back of the saddle. So that lighter area reflects where there's actually effectively a hole underneath the back of the saddle because the saddle is fitting so poorly. And this really reflects how important correctly fitting saddles are.
So that would correlate to the graph where the values were sub-zero.
Yeah. And then if we go to the next picture, this is of a different horse, and the orange arrow points to the hollows that we can see behind the withers, behind the shoulder blades, underneath the front of the saddle. And these are concavities which are created by a saddle which has tight tree points. And those muscles just never develop. And those horses will be restricted in their way of moving because they hurt, they're uncomfortable. And so therefore their entire back muscle mass will not develop properly, but underneath the saddle, where the pressures are excessive, the muscles will actually waste away. So this really, really highlights the critical importance of correct saddle fit for both the horse and also the rider, because if the rider is not in the correct position in the saddle, so their weight distribution is not appropriate, that will overload a part of the saddle, which will compromise the horse's movement and therefore the use of the back muscles. So it is of critical importance that the saddle fits correctly for both the horse and the rider if the back muscles are going to develop appropriately or not waste away. So of huge importance. And finally, we've got one more slide, and Jodie mentioned it earlier about the comparison pictures of horses before and after treatments. And I think that we have to be very careful when we interpret what we actually see. And when we compare the posture of this horse, which is the same horse, we can see it's not standing in the same posture with respect to its limb position or the head and neck position. The background is different, the lighting is different. The horse is attentive in the top picture, it's unattentive in the bottom picture. Its body condition score is different in the two pictures, and its hair coat is different in the two pictures. So I think it makes it really, really difficult to make any comment about the effectiveness with respect to muscle development and use in these before and after pictures. It may be that the horse was improved, but I think based on these photographs, you can't really make a correct judgment.
Yeah, it's very much like before and after pictures in human advertising, where there's all kinds of factors that could make a photo look different. Particularly lighting, I think, is underrated as a significant factor in how different pictures appear.
Yeah.
And then also you just don't know what's going on in terms of like nutrition and
No, I'm not suggesting that this horse necessarily has not improved. All
right.
I'm using is this to illustrate the fact that I think one has to be careful when looking at before and after pictures, which are not acquired with the horse under similar conditions in terms of its body condition score, its posture, the lighting, and everything else.
Yeah, and it's hard to recreate a photo in the same exact conditions.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, I can give guidelines about how to do it, but it does take time, and time is often a premium for everybody.
Right.
But in order to do this, if you're going to be monitoring a horse's shape, then you have to try to do it under standardized conditions. I think it is worthwhile as a rider who wants to improve their horse, doing various checks on their horse on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Acquiring photographs of them horse standing in a standardized position with the same background, so that you can look sequentially. How did the horse look 6 months ago? How did it look a year ago? And because that's going to tell you something about how the horse has been working and how effective your training has been.
Yeah.
Or it may highlight that maybe that there is in fact a problem. Just like I think it's important that we monitor the horse's behavior during tacking up and mounting, and we monitor the horse's behavior during ridden exercise, because those can tell us about impending problems or the absence of impending problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we encourage people to do regular evaluations with the ethogram. And I have clients that keep journals, and really it does make sense to have a photo record of progress, both to identify problems and to see progress. I think it's really important for people to feel like they're making progress when things are going well.
And I think human athletes are good at monitoring or undergoing monitoring, and they also keep records of when they've had low-grade injuries, and they also keep records of their training performances.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should probably do the same with horses, so
Absolutely.
that if I ask a client, is this horse easier on the right rein or the left rein, or is it similar on the right and left reins, they can tell me based on facts, not scratch their heads and say, well, last week I think, well, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, our memories are not.
Memories are not good enough. Memories are not good enough for any of us.
Yeah,
write things down. Keep a diary.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and it helps both with the physical progress and also with the mental part of it, being able to gauge where you're at, catch problems early, feel like you're making progress when you are. It's really helpful. I think if you have guidelines for how to do the set up the photography, that would be really helpful for people to share.
Yeah, maybe we can put something on the website about that.
We will. Okay.
Okay. We had a couple of comments, a question and comment on Facebook. One was earlier in the talk hitting on the importance of saddle fit. So I made a note for everybody to be able to follow up with that question. And there was one that was a specific issue about movement of a horse, and so it might be easier to address that offline as pertains to this conversation. But looks like we are pretty well ready to wrap up with things. I did want to throw a few slides on the screen so that people know where to find us and find additional information. So pop this back up again. Maybe, where's my share screen? There it is. It moved just like that. So again, we are a nonprofit organization, and if you have been enjoying this content and want to see more of it, please help us out by making a donation. And either way, if you are able to donate or not, please explore all of the resources that we have available. The 24horsebehaviors.org website, 24horsebehaviors.org. We have a whole library of these conversations with Dr. Dyson that you can look into. We have webinar links, article links. Dr. Dyson is consistently providing us with even more and more content, following up with answers to people's questions on our social media accounts. So be sure not to miss out on these resources that we have free for everyone. If you have people, maybe your trainer would benefit from this information. Maybe you are a trainer and you have your students would benefit. Maybe in conversations with your veterinarian, if you're a veterinarian in conversation with your patients, help spread the word that there is free information available for everyone that will help them as well as their horses. Of course, there is Dr. Sue Dyson's book that she authored with, pardon me, with Sue Palmer, Harmonious Horsemanship, Use of the Ridden Horse Ethogram to Optimize Potential Partnership and Performance. A fantastic book. Jody discussed the Ridden Horse Pain Ethogram or the Ridden Horse Checklist at the end of our conversation here, and we're always referring back to that as a great way to help track your horse's health and soundness and catch problems before they become worse. And coming up, we will have another conversation that feeds right into our conversation from today, understanding the importance of posture and what is going on with posture. So we'll go a little bit deeper dive onto that topic that we started talking a little bit about neck posture today, but looking at overall posture next week. So be sure to...
Next month.
Pardon me. Next month. Time flies, but hopefully not that fast. My gosh. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Dyson, for all this valuable insight, putting together these great images and packets of information for us to share with everybody. And we'll look forward to seeing you next month, February 13th, to talk about posture.